In this video, we will look at the two types of bar chart that we'll cover in this course. They are bar charts for displaying the distribution of a categorical variable, which you see here, and bar charts for displaying a summary statistic of a particular measure within or across categories of another variable. So the first one is probably fairly familiar to you. It's a standard bar chart where the height of the bar corresponds to the percentage of cases. In this case, people on the survey who answered either Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Green Party, and so on. And this illustrates the components of most of the graphs that we'll look at here, which are we have a vertical y-axis, a horizontal x-axis, units of the variable here on the bottom, the categories of the variable, on the bottom, in this case, political parties, and the units of measurement on the y-axis. So in this case, we're using percentages. It's important to be aware of this because in some cases, Stata will default to using just the count. It'll display the number of cases. The relative heights of the bars will be the same, but it just makes it a little bit more difficult to interpret. So you want to make sure that for a bar chart like this, the height of the bar, the axis, the y-axis, is in percentages. How do we read it? We simply look across categories of the nominal or ordinal variable, and we read off the height of the bar. You can label these if you want with the actual percentage, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. The second type of bar chart then is where we have some type of summary statistic, generally a mean, could be a median as well, or it could be a standard deviation. Later on, we'll look at different types of charts that contain error bars when we get into discussing standard errors and so on. And in this bar chart, we have two variables. In this chart, the y-axis is showing us mean education. So this is years, average years of education within each of these different groups. And in this variable, this is a question from the ESS that asks if you favour allowing many or few immigrants of a different race. And so they give the respondents different options: many, some, few, or none. And in this case, we can see here that mean years of education decline as we go across those different categories. So if you like, as support for that statement declines, as in the less favourable people are about immigration, the lower the years of education. Again, we're kind of phrasing this in terms of kind of causal relations, where quite obviously it's not, but it is showing us that there is something going on with respect to education and attitude. So how do we draw these? Let's take a look at implementing these in Stata. So in this example, I'm going to work with the European Survey of Income and Living Conditions. And we'll look at a couple of variables. We've got the shorthand codes here for the variable names, PH010HS and so on. And if you want to, you can start by inspecting the distribution of those variables. You can look at the labels and you see here, this one is health. This one is ability to make ends meet, measured on an ordinal scale. And this one is tenure status, whether a person's an owner or a renter and so on. So to display categorical information like this in a bar chart, one of the easier ways to do it is to use the histogram command and to define the data as discrete. This will become more apparent when we look at how we draw histograms for scale data. But basically what we're doing is we're going to draw a chart and we're going to tell Stata that the data in it are discrete. These are discrete categories. You can see here they're mutually exclusive: great difficulty, difficulty, some difficulty, and so on. And respondents can only answer one of these 5 options, 6 options, or 5 options, and so on. So these are discrete choices. They can take one answer and only one answer. The standard histogram command then is hist. And again, a lot of these, as I said, are truncations. If we were to write histogram, the same thing would work, but we can abbreviate it to hist. We, after the comma, add an option that says that the data are discrete and that we want the axis in percentages. And if we run that, we see we get a graph that looks something like this. And this isn't an especially useful graph because there's a couple of things missing. We don't have a title. We don't know what this variable is. We don't know what the units of measurement are. Again, these are just our value labels, but we don't know what 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 correspond to in terms of labels. In this health variable, they correspond to categories of health, but we don't know which one and we don't know which way they go. So again, just to familiarize you with the logic of Stata syntax, after the comma, generally we're adding options. So we have already discrete. We've told Stata that the data are discrete. We want the axis in percentages. Now we're going to tell it that we want to label the x-axis, and we also have to give it 3 more pieces of information: the lowest value, the highest value, and the interval. So we want the x-axis to start at 1, to end at 5, and to have a gap of 1, which means we'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. There are instances later we'll see where you might want to widen that interval. If your variable has 10 categories, you might want to change that. You would obviously change that to 10, but we'll just run it and see what happens. So that now when we do this, we lose that 0 label here, and we just have categories 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it's an improvement, but again, we don't know what the categories mean. So we are going to add some more settings to it again. So within the X label, we're going to add a comma and ask it to give value labels at an angle of 45 degrees. I'll just draw your attention to this here, which is the parentheses. One common error that you will get when running Stata code is an imbalanced parentheses, and that means there might be a bracket missing somewhere, or there might be an extra bracket and so on. So the brackets need to balance in a particular way. And you see we can alter anything we want in here. We can alter the angle by simply changing the angle. If we want it slightly more acute, we can reduce it and so on. And we're also adding a title. So our title is going to be Self-Reported Health Ireland 2019. Now remember, whenever you see these little line breaks here, that means you got to run the code as a single chunk. And once we do that, we should get some labels on the bottom axis. So here we have Self-Reported Health in Ireland 2019. Very good, good, fair, bad, very bad, and so on. So there's many other things we can do as well. We can add, we might want to space the bars. As you can see from this one, the bars aren't really that spaced out. They're kind of clumped together. There's a little setting we can use here, which is gap 15. We can add a subtitle, which is a title that defaults to slightly smaller text just under the main title. And again, if we run all of that, we get something that looks a little bit neater. Now we've got separation in the bars, and we've also added this additional setting here, which is add labels. And what that will do is it will add those labels to the bars to show you exactly the percentage of respondents who reported each of those. Again, a lot of this is all flexible. If you wanted to remove the labels from it, if you thought it looked a little bit messy, you could simply change that in the code, run it again, and then you just get this. Now graphs can also be split by categories, but as I suggest here, you should balance this against visual parsimony. What that means is that it's fine for graphs with a small number of categories like health or tenure and so on, but when you start splitting graphs by very, very elaborate variables with lots of different categories, they can become very messy. So part of the challenge here is about getting them to look pleasing, and also to have them be legible, and that people can read them essentially at a glance without expending too much effort in figuring out what every different part of it means. So we do this, we end up with a split bar chart, which is on the left we have a bar chart just for males, and on the right a bar chart just for females. How do we do that? We did that by adding this little option by, and then in brackets we have the variable that we want to split that sample by. To show you how this works then, if you wanted to split that bar chart for health by a different grouping, let's say you wanted to split it by categories of tenure. Again, there's no real obvious reason why we would do this, but let's just say for illustration, if we did want to do it, we would simply substitute the variable name within there, and then it will produce for us a breakdown where we get these 5 charts for each different category, and we can see if there's any variation in health across different categories of tenure. Now, a lot of the time you'll find that there's some tidying up to be done for these graphs. A lot of this can be automated, it can be coded, but the code to do this gets a little bit complex, and oftentimes it's not worth the effort, because you can simply, as I'll show you now, click around and start adjusting things. So here we have our graph. We've got our 2 sides, male, female, we've got our health, everything is more or less in the place we want it, but again, we've got these titles here that are looking a little bit messy. We've got a variable name that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and we've got some things down here that we might want to change. For any stated graph type, you can right click in the plot region, and you can click Start Graph Editor. And what that will allow you to do then is to click on any element and to adjust it as you want. So let's say we wanted to change this PH010 down here. Might not be as helpful. So we could change it to health, or we could change it to health PH with the variable name in it. We might want to take away this, and we might want to remove these headings and add a master heading. And we can do that. We can simply right click on any of these elements and click hide, right click hide, and then we can go up here to graph, titles, and we can give our graph a single title. Again, I'll show you later on how we can code this up a little bit more quickly, but if you are trying to adjust the graph for aesthetics, quite often it can be easier to click around into the graph and adjust things, experiment with them, and see how they look. So we'll give this a title, just a shorthand title for the moment, which is Health Ireland 2019. You can add a subtitle. You would probably want to use something a bit more detailed than that, and then we can close it up. If you wanted to get rid of this because it's quite obvious that they're split by gender, you could hide that as well. And then when you're happy with the layout of your graph, you can click Stop Graph Editor. And then finally, if you want to save your graph, you can right click in the graph area and click Save As. You can also get it through File, Save As up here if you want. There's also a save icon there. You go right click Save As. And what you need to do then is to go down here, and if you want to save the graph in a format where it can be opened in Stata, again, you can save it as .gph. If you want to include it in a report or a document, the most accessible ones if you're pasting it into Word probably are these ones here, Portable Network Graphic and TIFF. Where is it? So yeah, generally these two here, if you want to chop and paste them into a graph. And this one here, if you think you might want to come back to the graph later on and edit it again, .gph is the native Stata graph format, just retains all the information in the photo without flattening it. Now, another way to do this is by using the conventional graph command. So we'll take this variable again, this ph010, and the graph bar command. You'll see here that there's a few differences between this one and this one. The percent setting comes here before the comma, and then the variable comes after the comma. So we're essentially declaring the variable afterwards. I'll run the code first and show you how it looks. You can see here it's a little bit neater in the sense that it allows you to, with relatively less code than it would take with the hist command, to get a nice title and to get this in place and so on, and you still get the split between male female. And we've also added labels. It's a little bit messier, I suppose, so we might want to suppress maybe some elements of that to give it a little bit more space. Or we can change the font size. We can increase the axis up here with some more settings if we wanted. There's all sorts of things we can do to make this look a little bit better. But you see here, even though the code is different, you'll start to see some similarities, like using by to split the chart by categories of another variable, to label the bars if you wanted to. Again, you can chop and change a lot of this code as long as it's consistent, and you can go back and you can get one with just the bars. So that's how to draw some basic bar charts in Stata and how to split them over categories of a second variable.